Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues. And with this video, I'll be discussing my thoughts on episode 11 of the anime series Violet Evergarden. And this was, for all intents and purposes, another pretty decent episode. I did find myself getting misty-eyed toward the end of it, and it kept me on my toes. It was kind of, interesting in that it didn't quite play out how I expected. I didn't really know what in the hell was going on until the very end. And it kind of played with my expectations. And one of the overarching things that I can say about this episode is touching upon something I've talked about before in my episode discussion coverage of Violet Evergarden, the anime series, is that the plotting of the series, as I've talked about before, feels like it's been all over the place. The direction, the plotting, some of the early going episodes and stories felt like they would have been much more complementary to the latter half of the series. And this episode was a pitch perfect example of the opposite, where I feel like this story should have come much earlier in the series. Putting a stamp on Violet getting in touch with her emotions, being surrounded by soldiers whose lives were being taken due to war, and love letters home and all that kind of stuff. I mean, this really would have been poignant a few episodes earlier than where it ended up being, I thought, by the end of it. And, but, for all intents and purposes, it is somewhat comical how she, steals off with the order, the request for a doll at this encampment, Camp Menace or whatever it was called. And the troop, this is one of the areas where it surprised me because the troop is, for all intents and purposes, on the move. They're going to be leaving. And we see that this troop with the sort of main focused character Aiden, they end up getting picked off one by one by snipers from the opposing forces. They're up on an overlook and they've trapped them, for all intents and purposes, in this little woodland area, and they're all getting picked off one by one. And Aiden and a sort of younger character, after their sort of commanding officer, gets picked off first. He's, wounded, the young man, and Aiden's trying to drag him to safety. They end up doing him in, and Aiden gets shot and all this kind of stuff. And I was starting to wonder, like, at first, I was like, okay, this is probably going to be a typical rigmarole kind of thing where, Violet goes to this encampment and she's writing letters home for all of the soldiers, at least a small group of them. And they will end up moving on. They'll go back to the war effort or whatever it is, and there'll be some bittersweetness toward the end because those letters are going home and those soldiers died or something. I thought that's where it was probably headed. So we get to that point where Aiden's troop is all but picked off. He's like the last survivor, and I'm starting to wonder, oh, okay, wait a minute. So is Violet going to, show up and then she's writing letters for the other guys? For the enemy? How exactly? Are we shifting focus? What exactly is going on here? And then there was the uber plot convenience where you kind of had to, rein in your disbelief, your suspension of disbelief, because she, for all intents and purposes, talks like one of these postal delivery guys into hopping in his plane, and she's going to halo jump out of it. And she pointedly lands right where the guy who sent the request is. The enemy forces are surrounding him. They're talking about, carving him up or something like that. One of them's wielding a knife in any case. And it's not looking all too good for him. And she just happens to find him land right there. But then adding insult to injury for that suspension of disbelief, you've also got one of the enemy forces who pointedly recognizes her immediately and then calls all his boys off. She knocked them all down. She's bobbing and weaving and not getting shot and everything like that, dodging all the bullets, which is insane in and of itself. But here this guy recognizes her and he's just like, dudes, forget it. We can't handle her. We're no match for her. Let's go. And they all go without, they all leave without even questioning it. She turns around, are you Aiden, such and such, did you send the thing? And yeah, I'm thinking she turned around, shoot her. Why didn't they just pop her in the back of the head right then and there? I guess they don't consider her necessarily a soldier. Maybe they consider her a civilian, and so that's why they're going to leave it be. Even though she does knock them all on their asses for all intents and purposes, it was a little bit, skirting the disbelief there. But where it really, sort of gets back on point for me is the fact that, here Aiden is dying, and he's clutching that photograph of his, beloved Maria. And so I was again kind of surprised that they then eschewed that temporarily for his immediate focus being a letter to his parents. And the discussion there was quite intriguing. The idea of, like, if you love me, you love me as your son, and if you believe in reincarnation, because I know my time is limited, I'm going to die here as I'm imparting these words. I hope that you find yourselves again in the next life, and that I'm blessed enough to be your son again, and will you have me, and these kinds of really intriguing sentiments. And it was touching, I thought. And I was actually really impressed. We do see Violet throwing down with these guys, knocking them on their asses, as I say, but I was much more impressed with the very intriguing aspect of how her mechanized hands are typing out the letters. I don't know if that was just, her blowing smoke up Aiden's butt because he's dying and she doesn't have time. She didn't have her typewriter or something, or it would have taken too much time to set it up or whatever like that. I don't know if she was actually legitimately, memorizing the words in her fingers as she described it, something like that. But I thought that was a really intriguing idea. If that is true, if there's some truth to that she's like typing and like somehow the operation of that can be memorized meticulously in her fingers, so that she need but only sit down in front of a typewriter again and it writes it all out exactly as it was worded. I doubt it. I think it was probably she was just doing that to suffice for him, that I'll be able to impart these words to your parents, to your beloved Maria and everything. And she kind of has to prompt him to even recognize that he wanted to write a letter to Maria herself. And, you see at that point, Violet's not even doing the finger movements anymore because he's passing away. He's dying right then and there. He can't see, per his own words. And so she need not put up, the facade of typing and whatever like that. And he begs for her to hold his hand. And, it's cold to the touch because, of course, these are mechanized hands. They're not human hands. But she gives him a parting kiss, which in his, I don't know what you would call it, sort of succumbing to death, he envisions as being a kiss from Maria. And it was touching, and it was very bittersweet, but where I really lost it was, of course, the pseudo epilogue where Violet has managed to find the parents and Maria, and I guess she's like living with them or something like that. I know he said that they grew up together and everything like that. I wasn't sure if that meant like, she was an adopted child next to him or whatever. But she's there with the parents and they call out to her and the parents are crying and she knows immediately, which then, of course, her suspicion is solidified when Violet hands her the letter and there is the blood-soaked handkerchief of his. And, they could have, for all intents and purposes, ended it there. I was already misty-eyed, but I was that much more so when the mother goes and embraces Violet and thanks her for bringing their son home again. His last message to them. And she starts bawling. This is where I'm saying it should have been earlier on in the series because she's getting in touch with that idea of what love is, of losing someone, unrequited love, somebody being taken out of your life and not being able to answer to that anymore and having that void in your life suddenly and having to cope with that and think about moving beyond it. And, sadly, that's just a part of life. Death is very much a part of life and living. And it just feels like that would have been a lesson much more poignantly made if it were earlier in her story, that kind of thing. And then, as I say, the topic of conversation, the way in which it was talked about, his dying and leaving these messages for his parents and his beloved, and especially in the way he talked about it to his parents. If reincarnation is a thing, if I can one day be your child again, I hope that you'll have me. I hope that we will be brought together again and reunited, and just really interesting things, to consider, to think about, and the way in which it was characterized, and Violet's feeling the impact, the emotional weight of that, and being brought to tears by the end, and apologizing for not being able to save their son, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it was well orchestrated for what it was, and I feel like it would have been much more impactful earlier on. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below what you thought of episode 11 of Violet Evergarden, if you've seen it as well, if you agree with me, disagree with me, love it or hate it, anything goes in the comments below, as long as we have a great conversation. And if you didn't find this particularly an impressive episode, let me know as to why. If you loved it, if you felt every emotional impact and thought it was, well done and everything like that, if you agree with me or disagree with me, that it should have been earlier on in the series, all that good stuff. Just love having that conversation, as I say. And so yeah, otherwise it'll be pretty much it for me on this. If this video finds you well, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.